Chapter 72. The palace was turned upside down as the war came closer. The country was preparing for war, and Celine was in a frenzy as she oversaw the preparations and hurriedly created more herbs and medicinal treatments with the healers. She had personally asked the blacksmith to create an armor for Red and Draco to withstand an onset of arrows which took up all of her free time. She was emotionally drained and anxious, for she had never been to a battlefield before. She worried over the soldiers' safety, for Celine had become closer with each of the men and women involved. Most of the drafted soldiers were young and filled with endless energy, which made Celine adamant about ensuring their survival and safe return home. Due to the busy schedule, her relationship with the Emperor was forced to be mended for the time being. She worked closely with the Emperor, who taught her how to defend herself and wield a sword. Celine felt nostalgic, and the awkward tension briefly went down. At the same time, the feelings and attractions Celine feared would grow unfortunately grew. She couldn't help but feel attracted to a man who had become a confident and wise leader. He offered her comfort and familiarity as she grew increasingly anxious over the war. He calmed her nerves and fears whenever she felt overwhelmed. Celine could only appreciate his warm presence that was like a pillar. A couple of nights before their departure, the soldiers drank with the Emperor to loosen the stress and burdens of battle preparations. Both men and women mingled flirtatiously, and the adrenaline coursed through everyone's veins. The people wanted to spend their last moments happy and escape reality, for no one knew what misfortunes the war would bring. Celine felt the same way, and she drank many cups of liquor, becoming tipsy and giggly before she knew it. The drunk people flocked around her, praising her for the technological and medicinal advancements. Because of Celine and the Emperor, we will surely win the war. Lady Celine is so beautiful and also a genius. The compliments made Celine smile warmly. As she spoke to the men, her eyes drifted towards Akihiko very frequently. Perhaps the alcohol was the culprit for the tug in her heart. However, her mind was filled with the Emperor that night, and she didn't feel the need to push down such odd emotions anymore. He eventually caught her stares and smirked. However, Celine was feeling bold and walked over to the Emperor. Now that she was drunk, Celine could finally be honest to herself. He had slowly permeated into her heart, and the love for the Emperor had transformed into something deeper. The thought was overwhelming, yet drunk Celine couldn't think logically anymore. She couldn't deny that she saw Akihiko in a different light. "Aki," she called out softly. The officials surrounding the Emperor coughed in embarrassment after hearing their stoic leader call out to another man seductively. The Emperor was not drunk, and he only laughed at Celine's adorable form. Her cheeks were stained red by the alcohol, and she looked lovely when smiling so radiantly. "Yes, Celine," he extended his arm out and gently helped the woman to her seat. "We really came this far, Aki." Celine accepted his help and sat like a child guided by its mother. She stumbled and nearly lost her balance, yet the Emperor held her back firmly. "I'm very proud of you, you really grew up so well." She unconsciously scooted closer, leaning in to breathe his fresh scent. She closed her eyes as she felt the floor spinning, making her dizzy. "I'm so afraid of what will happen. I never thought I would ever go to war. I'm scared that some of us won't make it back." She smiled sadly, looking around her surroundings, watching everyone laugh joyfully and not paying any attention to them. Were they all secretly sad and terrified like she was? Were they all pretending to be strong? "I will protect you and my people. All you need to do is take care of yourself," he answered simply, as if such heavy thoughts did not weigh down his mind. She rested her chin on the palm of her hand and admired the Emperor. He sat in the most luxurious robe, wearing a divine color as deep as red scales. His silky black hair was braided, revealing his cold, narrow eyes. Next to the Emperor, Celine felt underdressed in her simple beige-colored gown. She hadn't been given time to restock her cosmetics, prompting her to go makeup-free. The only fanciful part of Celine today was her braided hair, which was pinned tastefully into a Christian-style updo. Still, the Emperor watched her as if her beauty exceeded all standards. It made her feel nervous. "I know the chances of us winning is very high. To be honest, I really feel bad for creating new weapons. I feel as if I have changed the course of history. But we just can't lose the war." She mumbled, and the Emperor strained his ear to hear. "It's worth it. I will take care of everyone," she announced brightly, before slumping back down. The Emperor only raised his eyebrow and leaned even closer, smoothly brushing her hair away from Celine's face. He froze as he had never seen Celine in such a vulnerable state. He wanted to pour kisses all over her cheeks, yet he refrained himself. "I think you drank enough for the night. I will call for a servant to take you back." "Your Majesty, I've been wondering for a while now, but I must ask you a question," Celine spoke slowly, ignoring the Emperor and grabbing his arm. The Emperor sat still as she pulled him closer so she could whisper into his ear. He could only look at her and wonder as her voice tickled his ears. Without waiting for a response, she asked, "Why do you love me so much, Your Majesty?" Chapter 73. "You truly don't look at other women, and I just can't understand that," Celine complained. "Why not?" The Emperor grinned as he watched the elegant woman abandon the manners she once trained so hard to maintain. He smelled the alcohol reeking from her mouth, yet he didn't seem to mind despite the close distance between them. "Because men during this time period have multiple women and have no sense of loyalty. You are handsome too, so all the women would have already approached you already. In fact, there is a harem for you. Do you not have sexual desires? Are you not tempted? I have always rejected you, so you must have went after other women instead," she mumbled, frowning at her own words that seemed to sound slightly jealous. "Isn't that your fault?" The Emperor smiled broadly. "What do you mean?" "You drilled it into me. You can't have multiple women at once. Don't ever be a polygamous person. A man is truly trash if he has more than one woman." He recalled all of her teachings, making Celine giggle as she remembered. "You drilled it into me so much that I can't be such a whore. So why do you ask me that?" "Because I didn't think you took my words seriously. What if I said I love you so much that I never considered looking at another woman?" He closed the distance between them, pulling her seat closer to him. "But still, I asked why you love me. I truly racked my brain, and I really can't understand why you still love me," she whined. "You really want to know?" he teased her. "Yes, tell me. I've never seen things the way you have. Never lived in your world. That's why I love you. You're different, you know? You live by another standard. It is fair and just," he replied softly. "That is why the second prince fell in love with such a beautiful lady. I still feel that way, but now the reasons grew by tenfold. But all you need to know is that I will only look at you. I will only love you, so I am waiting until the day you accept me." They couldn't stop smiling at each other as he whispered sweet words into his ears. Celine couldn't help but grin from ear to ear. She was drunk and wanted to wrap her arms around the Emperor. She felt the desire to kiss him strongly. He's just too dazzling right now. However, lately I feel as if I don't need to wait too long anymore, Akihiko mused. Celine only laughed. Then, should we fall in love properly this time? Without setbacks or hard obstacles. Just two people who are attracted to one another. When the Emperor widened his eyes, Celine immediately took his hand and pulled him up from his seat. Before Akihiko could stop her, they were running away from the banquet hall as his men cheered them on, and continued to celebrate. They ran through the palace grounds and he could do nothing but let her guide him. He watched her small back and silver hair flow graciously against the wind as they ran past ornately decorated hallways and gardens. She pulled him along, laughing in the dead of night as she finally stopped next to a pond filled with lotus flowers. There she stood abruptly and turned around. The Emperor was surprised by the bold look in her eyes. With a knowing look, she smoothly grasped onto his neck and pulled her face closer to his. His sharp features and slanted eyes seemed to be the epitome of beauty. Like a dragon under the moon, he was beautiful to the point it was unreal. "What are you?" "Shape. Just shut up," she giggled, placing a finger on his rosy lips. "You know, I thought all emperors and kings were ugly. I would read those history textbooks and think it must be awful to marry a noble. I still think this way, but you are the only exception." Celine leaned in and kissed the surprised man. Because Akihiko never believed Celine would love him in this life, because it had been far too long since he had felt her lips against his, and because her kiss tasted sweeter than honey, Akihiko didn't stop the drunk woman. He grabbed her cheeks and deepened their kiss, pulling her closer to his heated body. It was electrifying and the couple was overwhelmed with desire. She smiled, knowing that she had sobered up during their run. In fact, Celine had run for a long time so that she could have the chance to think more clearly before making this decision. She could feel every part of his presence, and her senses seemed to be more clearer than ever. Celine had tried so hard to keep her walls up and harden her heart. However, it seemed as if life was too fleeting. She wanted to embrace this man, even though he was the emperor. At that moment, underneath the star-studded skies, their relationship contained no promise or burdens. It was just two people falling in love. Chapter 74. The night before their departure, all Celine could think of was their kiss. She heaved a sigh, wondering what Hala would say if she found out what had transpired a few nights ago. In truth, Celine was aware that everyone wished for their union. Celine also knew that Akihiko was the only competent man she would ever consider dating in this world. Akihiko's moral beliefs aligned with Celine's and they were very compatible together. In fact, from the moment they met again in the night market, there were no traces of the young second prince left. Despite her constant denial, she knew that Zayden was now a full-grown man who could never be seen as a younger brother again. At first, Akihiko had been threatening and dangerous even. However, ever since his first marriage proposal to Celine, she had unknowingly been caught up in his games. She hated to admit it, but the emperor's recent collapse had hit her like a rock as she realized what he truly meant to her. It was a strange feeling, for she didn't think there was much growing left to do since she was mentally old. Over time, Celine's heart had slowly healed and given her a chance to live normally again. Her usual numbness had slowly disappeared, and she found life to be full of vivacity. The budding feelings for another person had flourished like a flower within her heart. After spacing out for so long, Celine felt lost in her own feelings. She wanted to empty her mind and contemplate what these newfound emotions would mean, so she called for Draco and spent the rest of the afternoon at the top of her palace wing. The air in Krastia was much more humid and wet compared to the Xianxia Empire. The scenery was filled with trees and forests, a much more serene view to calm herself. The road ahead of her was filled with uncertainties, yet she was entertaining such romantic ideas. Unfortunately, her time alone was cut short by the emperor himself. Celine nearly lost her balance, but she was immediately embraced by Akihiko, who steadied her with one hand. She cursed herself for her moment of clumsiness and felt awkward, quickly trying to composing herself. "How are you here, your majesty?" she asked, not pulling herself away from his grasp nor shying away from his touch. She masked her embarrassed expression, although the faint blush on her cheeks were clearly visible. This further excited the emperor, who smiled sheepishly. The moonlight was shedding celestial light onto their figures, a scene that she was all too familiar with. "You had been avoiding me for many days. It was almost as if you were shy," he responded bluntly. "Ah, yes, it probably seemed that way. I had a lot on my mind," she laughed awkwardly, flinching as he seemed to move slightly closer. "Is it because I did something wrong? Or are you ready to love me now?" he grinned, as if he already read all of Celine's thoughts. She blushed slightly, her heart seeming to quicken its pace at the mention of love. She cursed herself for being aware of her own feelings, for Celine couldn't stop her cheeks from staining red. "If I asked you to marry me, would you say yes?" He looked at her earnestly, trying to push for a confirming answer. "Why, your majesty, my answer is still the same. Even if I have feelings for the emperor, the first don't want the empress seat. I dream of a simple life, free from trivial drama or worries. I refuse to raise my children in such a stressful environment." Celine replied honestly. "But do you love me?" he pressed on. Celine only looked at him calmly, amazed by how brilliant his beauty shined under the moon. "I just began to return your feelings." The disappointment and frustration in Celine's response nearly drove the emperor crazy. He wondered why such an accomplished woman craved a boring life when he could give her riches. He was also not going to give up easily, especially now that her heart had slowly begun to open up. Akihiko was certain that Celine would accept him one day. They sat on top of the palace roof, staring out into the night sky, basking in nature's majestic beauty. Celine's heart was beating loudly, for it reminded her of the past, where they always looked at the desert night in the Xianxia Empire. It filled her mind with nostalgia, and their conversations drifted to their most cherished memories. She never felt any romantic emotions during that time, yet the memories had somehow become more romantic now. Celine smiled at him, unknowingly capturing his heart an infinite amount of times. "Actually, you make me feel very safe and comfortable. The scary world isn't so monstrous anymore, and I don't need to uphold the standards of this time period due to your majesty," she confessed. The emperor only stared at her silently, which was what Celine was used to already. He didn't enjoy chatting much, yet he loved to listen to Celine and often converse with her. Her beliefs and ideas were profound, and it always amazed him. I wish you remained here with your family instead of joining the war, the emperor sighed in defeat. Yet I know nothing I say or do will keep you from going. What kind of comment is that? I deserve to be there and I am equally as dangerous as you. Celine laughed at his ridiculous remarks. You know I'm not a weak princess. Don't offend me, she warned. The emperor only nodded, pouting as Celine seemed to take his words the wrong way. I just want you to be safe. It is very dangerous and you have never witnessed a battle scene. You also hate violence and without Draco, you have no physical strength. Your Majesty, Celine's voice turned cold. Did he really have to ruin the moment? If Draco dies, so will I. Don't worry about me like that because this is my choice. If anything, your Majesty's position is more dangerous than mine. Please remember that you were the one who dragged me to the palace. Not me. But that was before I regained my memories and realized how truly precious you are to me, the emperor protested. After giving the emperor one long look, she realized he seemed very dejected and anxious, as if this topic had always been on his mind. This further agitated Celine. Well, that's too bad. I'm not going to apologize and step down just because you feel that way, she rolled her eyes, annoyed by his sudden immaturity. Why was he bringing up such a topic now? Did he really think she would change her mind one day before their departure? Who did he take her for? The awkward silence engulfed the two adults until Celine heaved a sigh and spoke more softly. All right, let's stop for now and get some rest. We must sleep early for tomorrow's departure. As she began to stand up, the emperor caught her, gripping her arm very tightly yet delicately. Your Majesty. If you want to leave, then kiss me. Celine looked down at her hand, shocked at his boldness. When did he become more shameless than her? Why? Because his eyes were stubborn, and it seemed as if he was still bothered. Because what? Because I want it. I miss your soft lips. Now kiss me, please, he pouted. Akihiko looked dead serious. Celine could only laugh in shock at his audacity. She frowned, knowing exactly what the emperor was doing. She wanted to refuse, yet the emperor seemed too cute just now. The brutal rejection she had sent his way, along with their small argument a moment ago, seemed to be forgotten as she sighed heavily and finally leaned in to kiss him on the cheek. The act alone made her heart flutter in excitement. The kiss was also weird for her. She felt like a criminal for kissing a person she had regarded as a little brother for a good chunk of her life. However, she was reminded of the kiss next to the lotus pond and felt a rush of excitement. No wonder why I never had concubines, he spoke bluntly. His expression was rather calm and poised, but upon closer inspection, his eyes seemed to be set aflame with desire. However, he suppressed his emotions and swallowed his thirst, masking a more serious expression. You must promise me you will do whatever it takes to survive, Celine. You mustn't do anything reckless and always stay by my side. Of course. You must also promise me the same. The emperor nodded and let Celine go. We must live for a long time. I want to see you grow old, he whispered softly. Celine flushed red, not knowing how to react. She felt like a child as she fled the scene immediately. Celine wasn't a shy person, nor would she usually blush. However, those words coming out of that kind of handsome face would make anyone turn into a tomato. She couldn't help but smile. Her steps felt light, as if she was walking in the beautiful, secret garden of the Xionet Empire. The air around her was flowery and blurred with such a beautiful decor. Although the night sky was dark, she thought it was bright. It was like walking through the Milky Way. This was a dangerous feeling, yet she allowed herself to be happy. The night truly felt young. The emotions Celine had suppressed for so long had finally burst, and she didn't mind at all. On her way down, she didn't see the emperor struggling to hide his boyish expression as the familiars silently mocked him. To Red and Draco, Akihiko greatly resembled a young boy receiving his first kiss and failing to act normal afterwards. Chapter 75. The fateful day was far more gloomy than Celine had anticipated. The sky was cloudy when the soldiers set off to war, elevating the sadness within each families. Crowds filled with civilians were tearfully sending off their loved ones, while the nobles also wistfully stood in silence. Many families did not trust the new emperor, for the fire incident had taken a while to be resolved. The nobles were also skeptical and reluctant to go to war, yet his dragon seemed to soothe their worries. The people collectively agreed that the Christian empire was flourishing, and they were sure that Emperor Akihiko would return safely. The emperor proudly stood tall on his horse as Red was soaring through the sky and circling above the soldiers. Because of his mighty appearance, the emperor and his men were shining in effulgence. The crowd waved and cheered them on, masking their cries with encouraging screams. Even Celine's family was there to catch a glimpse of Celine, who was riding a tall, silver horse, one of the numerous forms of Draco. She smiled cheerfully at the children, yet it was not enough to stop them from crying out for her. Sir Vigos also watched from the palace. He would be left alone to defend the city. The emperor stationed some of his men to protect the people, and Sir Vigos along with his familiar would be the strength to reassure the emperor that they would be kept safe. The troops had a long journey ahead. They were to travel for a week in order to reach the border of the Xionet Empire, where the battle would take place. The plan was relatively simple. The troops were divided by men who specialized in horsemanship, archery, or swordsmanship. The first group of soldiers were a mix between swords and archers, while the cavalry flanked to the back and the sides. More experienced soldiers remained in the back, along with healers and young boys who were still training to be soldiers. This was a tradition for the militia during this time period, where young boys between the age of 13 to 16 who showcased the highest amount of potential were also brought to war. They did not participate in the battles, yet they assisted the healers and learned more about the art of war and medicine. The system was a tradition passed down for many generations, although Celine felt slightly worried for the teenagers who would witness the brutality of war. However, Celine couldn't say a word against this tradition that seemed to be rooted deep within their culture. The group was heavily armed with the sharpest steel swords and poisonous arrows as they marched onwards to meet their opponents. The war was expected to stretch out for many years, yet the first battle would determine where to station each envoy from Krastia's alliances. They marched onwards and took little breaks in between. The emperor wanted to reach the campsite early and wanted to minimize the amount of resources on the journey to the campsite. When Celine wasn't on horseback, she was flying on Draco's back, overlooking the soldiers and ensuring that the path ahead would be safe. She was also tired and extremely bored on horseback. Her bottom also ached since she wasn't used to riding for an extended period of time. However, this often led to Akihiko and Celine's bickering because he felt it was dangerous to do so. Unknowingly, they had become comfortable again, and the awkward tension had been replaced with jokes and sarcastic remarks. On the 5th day of their journey, Celine was exhausted to the point she regret joining. Riding on a horse all day and night was easier said than done. She absolutely abhorred camping. The only thing that made time pass by more quickly were the soldiers' gossip. She also noticed a group of young boys who were gawking at her appearance. It became quite bothersome as Celine realized she was the only woman in the group. It was obvious that men would lust after her like predators, yet they dared not to touch the emperor's precious woman. As they stopped to rest after discovering a nearby stream, Celine jumped off of Draco and let him recover for a while. She helped assist the emperor and stuck by his side as the group hunted for food and ate. They worked efficiently, and the group seemingly bonded over the teamwork. As night befell them, Celine decided to wait until all the men had gone to sleep. Then, she left the site to bathe in the nearby stream. Celine felt extremely dirty and wanted to take off her clothes, yet the emperor stood hovering over her as she was about to strip. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I'm covering for you, so that nobody will see." He didn't move an inch, even as she tried to push him away. "Nobody is here right now. Everyone already bathed except me. I made sure I'd be the last one, so I'd be alone." She rolled her eyes at his stubbornness. "Still, no." Celine's cheeks burned. Usually she wouldn't care, but it was different now that he had confessed to her like that, especially since she had begun to grow feelings for him too. "Then turn around. You can't look at me either." He smirked, his lips curving upwards as if he came to a pleasant realization. "You used to not care when we bathed together in the past, but I guess it's different now that you like me too, huh?" After that remark, Celine splashed water onto his face. "Get out." Akihiko laughed, the exhaustion disappearing from his expression as Celine struggled to push him away. "I'm serious though. Even though I already announced you as the Empress candidate, some of these men are instinctively animals at heart. He became serious and turned around in respect. Celine held in her response, wanting to point out that the only man she should be careful of is him. Instead, she stared at his back continuously as she began to remove her clothes and wash herself. Sometimes he would pretend to turn around and nearly give Celine a heart attack. She'd jump into the water and curse him indefinitely. It seemed as if the two forgot that they were in the middle of a journey to war. The next day, as Celine fed Draco some snacks, a small boy walked towards her. She turned around and smiled delightfully, finding the little boy to be adorable. He had messy black hair and a baby face with the roundest eyes. His cheeks were dyed red as he approached the prettiest woman he had ever seen. Both of his hands were behind his back, so Celine slightly narrowed her eyes. "Hello, what's your name?" I'm called Aaron," he replied shyly, blushing even more. "Hi Aaron, I'm Celine." "What brings you here?" Celine smiled warmly. His high-pitched voice that barely seemed to be going through puberty made her laugh. She found him too young to be traveling with them, yet he had shown incredible strength during the apprentice assessment system. Suddenly, he extended his arm and revealed what he was hiding behind his back. It was a white flower in its full bloom. Surprised, Celine accepted the flower with widened eyes. My brothers and I were playing around, and the flower reminded us of you, so here." He immediately fled before Celine could respond and dashed away. Wait, Celine wanted to run after him, yet she couldn't stop the smile forming on her face. "Thank you," she murmured. Then Celine felt a strong presence looming behind her. She was annoyed to find Akihiko again, watching Aaron run away with a blank expression. He only smirked, handing her a bouquet of white flowers without even watching her expression. How am I supposed to hold on to these flowers? Celine wondered. Chapter 76. On the day of their arrival, Celine was wondering how a battle would take place in such luscious, green fields. Endless hills stretched out despite the desert residing on the opposite side. It was a strange sight, one that Celine had never experienced in her other life. She helped set up tents and station the horses. Afterwards, she gathered resources from the lake with the help of Draco, Aaron and his brothers. There was much to be done, and the Emperor needed all the help he could get. After setting up a private camp, they were set to battle in these green hills bordering Xianxia and the Xianxia Empire. Celine was filled with anxiety and kept herself busy in order to stop the impending feeling of doom. Therefore, the days passed by rather quickly. She felt the tension build up in her stomach as she waited for the Xianxia army. Celine had also gotten closer to this little boy, and her anxious mood lightened up significantly. She taught him how to braid hair and even played with Draco while the soldiers were in official meetings. She rarely caught glimpse of the Emperor, and she also went through many defensive attacks to prepare. There were many times where the Emperor sneaked into her tent and attempted to convince her to not join the war and stay back with the healers. However, everyone knew that Celine and Draco's combined power could easily defeat a small army. Her strength was needed, especially since this was Xianxia's first battle. When the Emperor realized that he would never succeed in convincing Celine, he switched his tactics and gave her rigorous training in martial arts. Celine was able to yield a sword and practice combating with multiple soldiers. Before she knew it, Xianxia was facing the monstrous men of the Xianxia Empire. Each soldier was far bigger than an average Xianxian, symbolizing the huge presence of a dangerous lion. An average Xianxia man was built far bigger than an average Xianxian, and if Celine didn't know any better, this would be an easy win for the Xianites. However, agility and Xianxia's advanced technology prevented Celine from worrying about size or height differences. She also didn't question Akihiko's abilities. She scanned the opposing side for Emperor Lathe and the general, who were nowhere to be found. It seemed as if the Emperor blended into the crowd of soldiers covered in armor. Every soldier from the opposing side was covered from head to toe with protective gear, creating an intimidating front. However, one person she did not expect to see was the curly-headed woman who had ruined the lives of many. Celine's jaw nearly dropped to the floor in shock, even more so when Akihiko, who stood beside her, didn't seem to be fazed by her reappearance. "That bitch is alive," a soldier spit out as they watched Xavier flank to the side of a soldier. This soldier seemed to be more isolated than the rest, although he looked the same as the rest. Celine squinted her eyes and realized he was Emperor Lathe. for there was a lion standing next to them. It was rather difficult to discern the Zionite emperor from the group of soldiers, and Celine felt restless after watching the spectacle before them. The concubine was dressed more like the emperor than the emperor himself. Celine felt an eerie sense of discomfort, as if she was receiving an ominous premonition. "Did you know she was alive?" she turned to Emperor Akihiko. The emperor merely shrugged, as if it didn't matter. For Akihiko, he would defeat her in this life. His only worry was keeping Celine alive and away from her touch. However, Celine had no way of knowing what he was thinking. Celine narrowed her eyes at Xavia and observed her closely. The concubine looked as if she had come back from the dead. Her skin was so pale that she gave off a bluish tint, and her eyes were sunken in to the point that Celine could barely correlate her to the once feisty woman with honey-colored eyes. The entire army also seemed to be lacking any sort of human emotions. They stood silently, awaiting for their leader's orders without a single trace of movement. What is going on? How did Xavia survive? Celine was too shocked to wrap her head around the current situation. She wanted to question the emperor, who seemed to know something. She was uncertain and concerned for the Christian army, yet there was no time to think, for the sound of a horn exploded through everyone's ears and the battle finally ensued. Emperor Akihiko gathered his men, and they let out a cry in unison. Celine could only watch as she witnessed her first battle. Chapter 77. Celine felt numb as she flew high into the sky and shot arrows down below. She moved without a specific pattern so that arrows wouldn't find their way to Draco. He flew high up, then immediately dropped, crushing multiple enemies. The opposing side couldn't withstand Red's fire nor Draco's giant form. It was impossible to penetrate their scales, for Celine had created armor to withstand the poisonous arrows. However, Celine and the Emperor noticed that the soldiers' numbers were much smaller than they had expected. The battle was far too easy. Xianxia was clearly winning, yet some of the Zionate soldiers had been rather weak and timid. At first she assumed it was because of the two dragons on their side. Adrenaline rushed through her veins and she couldn't properly observe her surroundings. The world was too chaotic for her as she continuously brought down the enemies from left to right. However, Celine felt a strange sense of discomfort. Draco flew up into the sky and Celine was finally able to see how small the Zionite army had become. It was less than half of the soldiers she had seen right before the horn had blown. Where did they all go? Celine looked down to inspect Xavia's face and her frown only deepened. Although Xavia's eyes narrowed in surprise by their sturdy weapons, she still smiled arrogantly as if she had already won. By the time Celine and Akihiko realized something was amiss, it was far too late. The high-pitched screams began and sharply rang into their ears. However, it came from behind the Christian infantry and cavalry. The soldiers stood frozen, and the Zionites slowly retreated, signaling that the battle for today was over. Confused, Celine stood dazed as the opposing side withdrew abruptly. It hadn't been long since the battle started and there was no clear winner until a side forfeited, although the situation had been favorable to Xianxia. The group wondered where the screams were coming from and why it was so faint from the battle scene. It only took the Christians a second to realize that the Zionites had suddenly appeared from the side and encircled the army, avoiding a full-on frontal attack. Instead of fighting fairly, the Zionites went in hot pursuit towards the defenseless healers and young teenage boys back at the campsite. They were unprepared by the surprise tactic, and the Zionites showed no mercy towards the defenseless men. The act was unspeakable and evil at heart. Each country's goal was to assess any course of action to prevent any unnecessary loss of innocent lives while finding a way to win. Kingdoms fought for their respective countries to prove their unrivaled strength and sometimes accepted peace treaties. Any sort of surprise attack was frowned upon and avoided at all costs, because soldiers were meant to fight with equal strength to determine who truly was the strongest. Such dishonorable tactics were forbidden, and each warrior was thoroughly disciplined and taught to uphold a moral code. Healers and young boys who wouldn't participate in the battle scene were to be left untouched, for it was extremely shameful and dishonorable. No one wanted to kill healers and children anyways. The Zionate Empire especially prided themselves with the code of chivalry. Therefore, no one could have guessed that the Zionites would kill every single one of the defenseless boys and healers, then immediately retreat like cowards to their dens. It was a deliberate move to weaken the army and crush the fighting spirits of the men. Time seemed to slow down as Celine and Akihiko flew as fast as they could back to the campsite. They were the first to reach the messy scene, and they first scanned the site to look for survivors. However, the scene was gory and inhumane. The green grass was stained with blood and the stench of death filled their noses. Celine slumped to the floor as Akihiko cursed the gods and furiously carried out orders. Some soldiers yelled in pain while others fell to the ground, nauseous and throwing up on the side. The disfigured children were images that could even make the strongest man churn with disgust. Celine swallowed a painful sob at the scene, unable to tear her eyes from the children and healers they had failed to protect. Damn! They were just children, a man whimpered with a cracked voice. What kind of devils are we fighting? Another man spit out. Many older brothers who returned from the battlefield began to fill the air with their sorrowful cries as they looked for their slain kin. The men silently watched as the young adults searched and cradled their fallen brothers, while others scoured for any survivors. Akihiko's men struggled to calm their grief-stricken soldiers, who were screaming hysterically for revenge. A young man named Eli had brought all of his 3 little brothers to the war, and had triumphantly returned to find each of them slain by the throat. The thought of imagining his brothers' terrified screams as they realized no one would come to save them drove him mad. The young man had taken his sword and attempted to rush out in revenge, although he was immediately brought down by his fellow comrades. "Let go of me," he cried, struggling uselessly against the men. His shoulders were shaking and his hands could barely hold up the steel sword. "I will kill them. I will kill them all." "Eli, get a hold of yourself." The man held down the man who shook hysterically and heaved an ugly cry filled with agony. "I promised my family I'd protect them. I'd rather die than go home without them," he continued to cry, ringing into the men's ears. Celine cried silently and slowly trudged towards a small boy who had barely reached half her height. Having just turned 13, he was the youngest in the entire group, and his name was Aaron. His black, shaggy hair had been braided by Celine before she had left. His eyes were filled with light, yet his body was now cold and bloody from a chest wound. He was also Eli's youngest brother, who had been a gentle and kind child during the week-long journey to the campsite. She recalled the white flower Aaron had gifted her before returning to his other brothers and getting scolded by Eli. She remembered Aaron's bright smile as he had attempted to braid her hair in return. She stared at the boy so intently that Celine started to feel crazy as she noticed a small movement. Miraculously, his tiny fingers twitched ever so slightly, and it was enough for Celine to rush to his side and check his vital organs. Once she could feel a faint pulse on her fingertip, Celine's heart dropped to the floor. She wasn't sure how to treat Aaron, for she had never performed surgery in her entire life. If his stab wound was deep, then his chance of survival would slim. Her mind had become a blank slate at this realization. However, Celine forced herself to act quickly, although those few seconds of hesitance seemed to be 10 minutes long for her. "Do whatever you can," Celine yelled at herself and mentally pushed forward. "Hurry, give me supplies. There might be a survivor," Celine screeched desperately. She slowly lifted the boy gently, careful not to injure Aaron. As she turned his body around, she pressed against the wound gushing with blood. Aaron's eyes fluttered open as if he had been awakened, and tears spilled out of his innocent eyes. "I want to see Mommy," his high-pitched voice whined. His voice could be heard by everyone on the campsite. There was a storm in the Emperor's eyes as he watched the boy struggle to speak and wheeze in pain every few seconds. The entire group of soldiers surrounded the two, and Eli nearly crawled to his little brother. "It's okay, you'll see Mommy soon, so keep your eyes open and fight for me," Eli choked out, trying to give him a cheerful smile as Celine attempted to suppress the injury. "Did we win?" Aaron looked at his brother tearfully, his sad smile breaking the hearts of every soldier. Eli lightly squeezed Aaron's nearly lifeless hands and cried, "Yeah, we won, so don't leave." "Keep your eyes opened," he replied hoarsely. "I want TT to go home now. I want to leave with my brothers." He blinked a few more times, the blood spilling through Celine's hands. It hurts. "I'll take you home. So stay awake, Aaron, don't close your eyes. I'll give you whatever you want, so don't leave." Eli begged quietly, crying as he thought of his other brothers. Celine rushed frantically to position him appropriately and applied direct pressure with the gauze Akihiko had brought over. Aaron shifted his gaze towards Celine, who had always been like an angel to him, He felt as if everything would be all right since Celine was there. He smiled contently, running out of the energy to speak again. Eli began to make inaudible noises as he held his brother's hand. Aaron wrapped his tiny hand around Eli's finger, and the entire campsite anxiously watched the scene with hope. Thankfully, Celine had found him very quickly, or else he would have passed away from the poison or developed an infection. She spent many hours stitching his wound as the healers had taught her, keeping it clean and dry throughout the night. She took care of him dearly, desperately clinging on to the only remaining survivor of the massacre. She wasn't sure what she would do if Aaron didn't survive the night. Eli stood by her side and fetched any of the supplies she needed, helping her clean his wound every few hours. Meanwhile, the Emperor organized a grave and buried the dead, marking the inhumane massacre as a day that would never be forgotten. The agonizing screams and cries of vengeance turned into a sorrowful song of the night. The sounds were hauntingly sad, yet there was a promise for vengeance along with a farewell tune for the young lives that were lost. Chapter 78. The Christians had suffered a major blow today, yet the Zionists acted as if they had lost. Xavier watched in annoyance as many soldiers committed suicide as the guilt literally consumed them. Was my plan that evil? She asked no one in particular. She wrapped her arms around Emperor Late's neck and patted his soft, golden hair like a loyal dog. Celine's father had been furious by her proposal and couldn't stand Xavier anymore. He had rejected the surprise tactic proposed by her. The concubine had simply stabbed the old man and thrown him down a hill, then joined their side. He was left to die, and the Zionites had no choice but to obey her orders. It was a sleepless night for the remaining soldiers, who were anxious for their own healers and apprentices. Sometimes Celine would leave her tent to treat others. She had taught each of the soldiers how to perform basic self-medication procedures and disinfect their wounds. She only looked for soldiers who had more serious injuries before returning to her private space. She was the only healer left, and the soldiers urged Celine to rest in order to preserve her strength. Eli would watch over Aaron and call her if he began to show signs of a fever. She entered the tent one last time to check up on Eli and Aaron. Eli was huddled close to Aaron, possessively watching over him with fondness and deep affection. It tore Celine's heart that they experienced such a heart-wrenching event as adolescents. The suffering in Eli's eyes broke Celine. "Hey," Celine greeted hoarsely as she walked over to sit next to Eli. He jumped up and was about to bow when Celine stopped him. "My lady, thank you so much for saving my little brother. Without you, Aaron might have not been with us." His doughy eyes were huge and filled with unshed tears. He continued to kneel and place his forehead to the ground, sincerely thanking her for saving Aaron. Celine awkwardly waved her hand and ushered him to sit up straight. "Your brother is an angel to all of us. This should have never happened in the first place." Eli clenched his fist and nodded, his expression hardening. "My lady is the angel," he blurted and blushed in embarrassment. "You saved my brother when I thought all was lost. I was about to lose myself, go mad even. I am truly indebted to your highness. I will never forget, and I will vow to be a soldier worthy of you." She laughed softly at his vow, and Eli's ears turned red too as he clamped his mouth shut. "Thank you, Eli. You are not indebted to me. This is my job. Actually, whoever did this to Aaron was quite merciful. He didn't reach any vital points or tear any tissues. He just lost a lot of blood because he's young with a small body. He will live." Celine informed him matter-of-factly and blushed in embarrassment. She wasn't sure how else to comfort a teenager except with facts. However, Eli didn't seem to mind and was reassured. "How old are you?" Celine asked. "I am 17, your highness." She sucked in a breath. It's his first fight. He had just become a soldier and was barely old enough to protect his brothers. "Oh. Well, Eli, I'm sorry for your loss today. I'm sure your brothers are watching over you right now." She smiled sadly. No, I will avenge them. I will make sure those devils pay for what they did." His eyes that were brimming with tears had become determined with deep hatred and lust for vengeance. Celine could tell that he would one day be a great warrior or go down a bitter path. "I will also see to it that they will never get away with what they've done." Celine moved closer and gave him a warm hug, one that reminded Eli of his mother. Knowing how shocked his mother would be if news of the massacre reached their ears, he began to sob like a child. Ever since he had journeyed to the battlefield, he had put up a cold front in order to act as the eldest son. However, his brothers had been killed while Eren was in a deep coma. He felt utterly alone and shameful, as if the sad bitterness would consume him. Celine's embrace seemed to calm his depressing thoughts and release all the tension in his body as he leaned into her for support. "Why don't you tell me about your brothers instead of crying? I know they wouldn't want to be remembered by a cruel death, nor would they want their names to bring sadness." She smiled and intently listened to Eli, who slowly began to show a small smile. Chapter 79. Meanwhile, Akihiko and his officials were in a private meeting, planning out the next few battles. It seemed as if the concubine controlled the Xionite army, for her presence was more dominant than the emperor himself. Based on the recent news of her black magic usage, it was dangerous to assume that the soldiers were not affected either. The situation was grave, and the meeting lasted for many hours as the representatives from each alliance along with Akihiko sketched out the various tactics one could use. The emperor was wise, and he could easily calm a sea of men. He had used their sorrow and turned them into anger. His words sparked a fervent pride within each individual for their country, and the drive for vengeance immediately restored the soldiers' spirits. Celine returned to her own private tent, reflecting over the recent events. As her heart slightly cooled down and the weight of the battle affected her, she searched through her memories to see if her biological father was present during the battle. She believed that he was an honorable man who would never conduct himself in such a dishonorable act. She had read enough of the Xionite Empire's military tactics to know that surprise tactics brought them humiliation, and was the lowest method of action. Celine was also intrigued by Xavia's horrendous appearance that looked worse than death itself. She was curious as to how she had survived after drinking the most poisonous tea leaves, and why she seemed to be an important figure to the entire band of army. Celine knew that such troubles would occur, and she wondered if they could win a war when the opposing side used such evil means. Would they also need to dirty their hands? Would the code of chivalry not pertain to this war? This prompted Celine to immediately begin working on her new inventions, knowing exactly how to end this war. The blueprints and the parts required to assemble her desired object had been already made beforehand. Each piece was forged by a different man, so that no one would know how this particular weapon would be made. Therefore, Celine was deeply absorbed in putting together the parts alone. Her work was interrupted by a figure walking in at the dead of night. Celine jumped up and found Akihiko staring at her from the entrance. They hadn't truly talked to each other since the first battle and had been busy with their own tasks. She saw how exhausted and tired he looked as the war had taken a heavy toll on him. Although most would take in his current appearance as regal and intimidating, Celine only saw a man who was also traumatized by the heavy deaths of his people. For some reason she felt comforted by his presence and that it would be fine to shed tears in front of him. She nearly ran into his arms and wrapped her arms around Akihiko. She took in his exhausted appearance and stiff shoulders that seemed to relax slightly upon their touch. Celine wasn't sure whether she was seeking comfort during a lonely time or genuinely wanting him. She couldn't deny the strong desire welling inside her, and the appreciation for such a familiar person grew immensely. They sought comfort from one another until they moved towards the bed together. They didn't speak for a long time, for they didn't want to talk about today's disaster. Instead, Celine felt as if it was time to reveal her biggest secret. This battle had reminded her that life was incredibly fleeting. She wanted to be honest and leave with no regrets. In fact, Celine lost all sense of cautiousness around Akihiko now. "Can I tell you a secret?" Celine asked. The emperor nodded quietly, embracing Celine from the back as they lay on the bed together. She looked out at the entrance of the tent, avoiding eye contact with the emperor. "Would you believe me if I said I remember my past life?" Celine asked carefully, fidgeting her fingers. Celine told him about her previous life, up to her death, and how she had entered this universe. He listened quietly, only stroking her hair from time to time and readjusting their positions. He nodded, naturally trusting and believing her words instead of raising his eyebrows in disbelief. In return, she was the one who was shocked to see his indifference. "Do you truly believe me?" she asked in disbelief. Her confession had been sudden and out of the blue. Even she could barely believe the words coming out of her mouth. Instead of teasing her, the emperor nodded solemnly. "The story I want to tell you is more absurd, but it connects to your side of the story well." The emperor laughed, although his expression was grim. "Your story?" Celine pondered. That story you read before passing away, it truly did happen. It was the story of our first life. He paused and sat up straight, prompting Celine to leave her comfortable position and sit next to him. I don't know how the history of our first life ended up in a book at such an ambiguous way, but I'm sure it's not a mere coincidence. She straightened up and gave him a confused look. However, Akihiko's expression was completely placid, observing her reaction closely. Are you serious? Celine wanted to roll her eyes, yet he had accepted her without a doubt, so she decided to listen to Akihiko. He nodded, feeling slightly amazed that the day had finally come. The Emperor had been waiting for Celine to take the initiative and open up first. He didn't realize the day would be in the middle of war, but he was wide awake now. Don't play with me. I'm telling you the truth, she frowned. So am I. He slowly reached out, then hesitated, pulling away his hand again. I already knew that you reincarnated. When I received all of my memories. Celine widened her eyes. I don't think I ever told you though. You didn't. In fact, I'll tell you what originally happened to us in detail. The Emperor sighed. In that timeline. Even then I thought you were an angel. Out of your own curiosity you came to me. You were always the light of my life, even though you weren't as knowledgeable or intelligent back then. You didn't cultivate Draco or know anything about politics or business. We were just two innocent children who suffered under the Emperor's reign. You cared for me so much that I often forgot how cruel the world was. His eyes gleamed with softness, recalling cherished memories unfamiliar to her. You chose to love me and suffer, which is something I didn't realize until you left. That night when she cast a curse on me, when I realized what I had done, and that it was too late. His eyes were downcast, filled with guilt and shame. Celine had never really seen the Emperor cry. She was shocked to see him so shaken. She patted his back and encouraged him on. Tell me exactly what happened, Akihiko. Chapter 80. You're lying. This was the 20th time Celine had repeated the same exact phrase. Then that means... She had assumed he was lying, and that this couldn't possibly be the truth. However, it wasn't entirely impossible. He had retold the story that she had read in her past life, but in more detail. He repeated it multiple times without leaving behind a single event, and his eyes were mixed with emotions as if he was reliving the scene. Still in disbelief, she made him repeat the story many more times until Celine was finally convinced. The family members I have here are actually my real family members. This is my original body, my face, my life. I was raped by that Emperor. The first really helped you, and I suffered that horrendous death because of Xavia. You're also saying that the world quite literally became hell too. Celine spoke bluntly, as if these facts did not register in her mind. She thought about this alternative ending and nearly fell nauseous because Celine had lived through a similar timeline. I feel like my life is a lie. She shuddered, deeply disturbed by the realization. It still didn't seem real to her. She still felt emotionally distant and sometimes out of touch with reality. However, imagining that the story she had read about was about her own, Celine frowned. Then that means I loved you. She was fascinated by their original story, and her tears unknowingly spilled out again at their tragic end. She had no memories of that life, but the idea of this tragic story being hers was painful to take in. Even Akihiko grimaced and held her tightly. She heard the wild beat of his heart and shook. Celine almost wanted to push him away, however she knew that Akihiko was not at fault and didn't want to bring him any more pain. Are you upset that I don't remember our first life? That our past memories are now solely yours? She asked slowly. Of course I'm upset, but I think it's best if you don't remember, he replied firmly, shaking his head. It won't matter anyways because I will overwrite it. Celine stared at him incredulously. Akihiko, you shouldn't think about the past too much since I stopped reminiscing about mine. The emotions you experienced with me in that life will be much more different in this life. In this life, I didn't love you romantically when we first met, and I still do not wish to be an empress, she said strictly. Just then, Celine blushed and felt like a fool for accepting some of his advances and intimately cuddling him at the same time. Even now, she was in his arms. Of course. I only received my memories recently, so I know how to discern my current life from the past life. I know I have a long way to go before you are mine. The Emperor smiled and kissed her hand gently. Then the smile disappeared, turning expressionless again. His eyes shook as he spoke flatly in a cold manner. You say you don't want to marry me. But you married someone else. Celine fell still, as if she was caught in a love triangle with a non-existent third person. Celine felt ridiculous for comforting a jealous man in the middle of war, but she sat down, telling him that she had resolved all of her feelings for her past husband. The Emperor's feelings were more serious and even deeper than she had ever imagined. Celine wanted to be honest and show her sincerity while also drawing a line between them. The person I have feelings for is you. Yes, I did have a husband in the past, and what do you expect? For me to stay loyal to someone I don't remember? Therefore, you shouldn't think of my past in that way. I spent my entire life studying and working that I couldn't even start a family with my husband. I retained so much information that I was able to help improve this country's health and economy. That's why I have no regrets. Right now, I have grown feelings for you, so I don't know what's making you so upset. Where I'm from, couples don't think about marriage. She spoke confidently and drilled the Emperor with logical facts that he became speechless. He pouted. I'm the Emperor, of course I have to think about marriage. Do you even love me? There was a slight pause as Celine hardened her expression at his question. She knew she was being difficult, but she needed time to think. She had just admitted her feelings towards the Emperor, and jumping into marriage was overwhelming to think about. Especially since she would be both wife and empress. Just don't answer. I don't think I can handle it, he interrupted. Then pulled her into his arms like a defeated child. His grasp was firm and almost desperate, yet Celine felt comfortable leaning against him. The Emperor didn't need to ask any woman for their hand in marriage. However, he didn't want to press on and scare Celine. This was his second chance, and he couldn't mess it up. He knew she absolutely despised internal affairs and being the center of social circles. How could he dare force her to do anything? You had forgotten our memories. But I still found my way to your heart. I am at least thankful for that, he smiled at last, seemingly convincing himself to calm down. He had felt a strong urge to murder the man who resembled her late husband. However, the desire slightly lessened and his focus returned to Celine. However, he still felt the need to take a step further to ensure his worries. He recalled one of her many lectures over love and marriage. He wanted to try once more, so Akihiko climbed off the bed and kneeled with one leg, holding Celine's hand preciously. Will you marry me? Celine laughed, blushing with embarrassment at his intense stare. Her heart was fluttering, and she knew that their tangled love story was almost like fate. She would keep running, but eventually he would catch up. Even though Celine didn't want to marry, she couldn't deny her feelings. Would staying with this man be worth becoming an empress? It was the question that Celine ultimately needed to answer quickly. Therefore, her answer was different from the usual, brutal rejection. Maybe, Celine replied. The Emperor blushed for the first time, reminding Celine of the second prince's expression the first time they had met. His eyes were overflowing with happiness, as if she had agreed to marry him. I only said maybe, she reminded him. As Celine fell asleep, the Emperor gently released his hood and reluctantly left their private tent. He had a few more tasks to send out to the envoys and prepare for the next battle. He received news and carried out more orders, keeping himself busy with various work. After a few hours, the Emperor dismissed his closest officials and headed straight to Celine's tent for a break. There was a melancholic aura surrounding Emperor Akihiko as he looked up at the sky before returning to the tent. He didn't return to their small bedding. In fact, he sat crouched in a corner farthest away from Celine, who was sound asleep. He didn't want her to wake up from the tears spilling out of his eyes. He watched her silently, his heart aching in pain as he sniffled pathetically. The woman he loved ardently would probably never love him fully again. In fact, to Celine, he wondered how close he could get to her heart after all the wrongdoings he had committed. He knew this in his heart and believed it was punishment from the gods. Ever since his memories had returned, Akihiko had to suppress his overwhelming emotions and clamp down on his desires in order to win Celine's heart again. The woman who had loved him unconditionally became a formidable person. She had become a genius and seemingly harnessed the intelligence of a goddess. It was as if she was truly a celestial being. Akihiko knew in his heart that Celine would never belong to anybody. She was a person Akihiko would never be able to reach, and he could only hope there was space enough for him to squeeze through. He continued to cry and yearn for the loss of a woman who had passed many lifetimes ago. The memories of Kalina would only remain in his heart, and he had to bear with it alone. Somehow, it was much harder than he had anticipated, and it felt as if someone had stabbed his heart. Chapter 81. The next morning, Celine and Akihiko immediately sat down for another serious conversation. The topic was Xavia, the Xionet Emperor's concubine. After Celine realized that Xavia was actually some sort of evil being, she immediately realized that the concubine was probably possessed. When I saw her on the battlefield, she nearly looked like a corpse. Maybe Xavia is a rotting, empty shell that the devil possessed, she wondered aloud. Yeah, the body itself is probably still alive, but barely. The body is heavily malnourished and on the verge of death, which makes me wonder if the devil will find a new host. Celine sighed, unable to grasp the present situation. If someone outside overheard our conversation, they'd think we're crazy. We're talking about a concubine who currently commands the strongest army in the world, and also happens to be possessed by the devil. But I can't even reject this possibility because we were born with a dragon and fish as our familiars. I guess anything is possible here. She sounded dejected. The emperor smiled lightly at her tone. I find it odd that only the blood of Xionites received such a blessing. I think it is safe to assume that the gods are real and once favored the Xionites before abandoning us. You think the gods gave us another chance to save the world? Her eyes widened. Of course. You happen to be a genius and we possess the strongest familiars. We were also able to obtain our memories from our past lives. Do you think this is a mistake and only possible because of my wish? I believe that there is a stronger being who helped bring my wish to fruition. He paused. I also received news from my soldiers. The emperor informed her of the events that had transpired the previous night. It had come to light that Celine's father and many of his devoted soldiers had died instead of obeying Xavia's orders. They were found rotting deep within a nearby forest, and Akihiko had given them proper burials for the sake of her step-family. However, Celine's father had still been alive, fighting until his very last breath to deliver a message to Celine. He had informed the Emperor of Xavia's mind control and Emperor Late's condition, along with a wish for Celine to protect his wife and son. The Emperor was reluctant to share the news, knowing exactly how Celine would react. He didn't want her to save his family, for it was a dangerous mission, and they couldn't afford to lose any more soldiers to carry out this task. The Emperor also didn't want to lose sight of her. However, Celine surprised the Emperor again. Let's find a way to save the innocent families and Emperor Lathe. Celine was currently flying on Draco's back and overlooking a burning city. The Xionite Empire was currently burning and engulfed with flames. She had barely convinced the Emperor to let her go alone in order to not waste any soldiers. In fact, she had marched out after the Emperor denied her proposal and flown straight to the Xionite Empire in the middle of the night. Celine had pretended to reject the Emperor when he wanted to accompany her to sleep. She had tightly closed the tent and instructed Eli to make sure no one entered, especially the Emperor. Knowing that Celine was upset, the Emperor reluctantly gave her space, which gave Celine a chance to leave during the dead of night. However, she regretted this decision and wished she had came as a group. The ashes fell down like snow as if the world was ending. As she looked down at the melting buildings and terrifying black smoke, Celine realized she could only save a handful of people. She only had two choices: save her stepfamily and leave, or return with a bigger group to put out the fire. However, even if Draco used water to put out the fire, he'd run out of energy to save and carry her back. If she went to call for help, there would be no one to save. Right now, the fire was spreading too fast for her to save the city, and Celine had to make a quick decision. The consequences of her future actions made her tremble and shake as she located Oren and his mother. They landed on a safe spot in the middle of the market. Celine had helped the Emperor install a fountain in the middle of the town square, creating a water system that had made the town cleaner. Now it was the only structure standing as the fire burned through the city. A group of people stood inside the fountain, huddled close to one another and soaked in the water, hoping that it would save them from the fire. They were the survivors who had somehow escaped the flames before it engulfed their homes. The people saw Celine and cried out in relief. However, the crowd became silent again as they realized she was the only person who had come to save them. She desperately scanned the crowd to find the duo, and was overwhelmed with the feeling of helplessness. Celine, you came to save us. A small boy called out to her, jumping out of the fountain to run towards her. His eyes were filled with hope as he dragged his mother by the hand. Oren, the mother, struggled to jump out, and Celine saw the bulge in her stomach. She's fucking pregnant. Celine cursed at the situation at hand and strode towards the woman. In a hushed whisper, Celine greeted her. I came to save you too, because of his dying wish. But why is the city burning? The mother's round eyes flashed with grief and defeat for a split second, and she held her son closer to her. She shook her head as if she was also clueless. Celine only nodded and guided the two to Draco, holding back her questions until later. The pregnant woman accepted Celine's help and carefully climbed onto Draco's back. Celine felt the guilt crawling up her neck as the people from the fountain watched. There wasn't much time left, and she couldn't spare any more thoughts. She didn't want to imagine where the rest of the citizens were, and she attempted to drown out the screams of the people in the background. However, a desperate woman grabbed onto the sleeves of Celine's dress and begged. I beg of you to save the children, miss. We don't expect to be saved, we are not greedy. Our children are young and have much to experience. Please take them with you and at least save them, she cried, and Celine frowned, her heart shrinking inwardly. It thumped loudly against her chest as 4 small children were ushered towards Celine. Each child cried, not wanting to be separated by their families. Celine swallowed a sob as she realized they were the only surviving children in the group. There were only a few families in the fountain, and all of the adults' expression was resolute. They knew that Celine couldn't save all of them, and the adults collectively came to a silent agreement. They exchanged a single glance and looked at Colleen. They put up a strong front and looked at their children with the kind of love that moved Celine's heart. The parents weren't scared of death. In fact, they trusted the strange woman who had come to save them. It was eerily peaceful as the parents embraced their children for the last time. She helped the children climb onto Draco's back, and they all clinged to one another. After a few minutes, Celine looked back and felt a tear trickling down her cheeks. I'm sorry. The adults looked at Celine in amazement. It looked as if her tears were made out of crystals. They were only thankful that the children would be saved, and the savior appeared to be a maiden from an old legend. They felt rather reassured that their children would be in good hands, and they smiled. Don't be sorry, miss. Thank you for saving my child. Thank you very much, may the gods bless you. Thank you, the mother cried and smiled, waving at her child seated behind Oren. She couldn't bear to hold back her tears and looked away, motioning Celine to escape quickly. The woman turned her back, which was the last image that the child saw. Celine climbed onto Draco's back, who slowly drifted upwards as the flames began to reach the town square. The children cried as they watched their parents grow smaller like ants. Celine broke down at this scene. However, she mentally clutched her heart and gripped Draco. Until we meet again, a mother shouted. Live the life you want. I will always love you. Always do good. The parents had appeared strong for their children until the very end, smiling and waving at the children as if they too would be saved shortly. Celine carried out this mission alone and brought them to her mansion, offering refuge and a new home for the children. The siblings were excited to see Celine and their new family members. Ichika and Easy's mother quickly greeted Celine's stepmother, who was exhausted from the travel. Meanwhile, the children were confused and needed time to adapt to their new environment. However, Hala welcomed them warmly and nearly cried once she heard their stories. Celine felt numb as she returned to the battlegrounds alone. The Zionite Empire had truly fallen. The empire that Lathe had loved and wanted to protect, the empire where Celine spent her early years with Akihiko. She grieved silently at the lost city, as she realized that Xavier truly meant to destroy the world. Even as Celine felt miserable and desperately needed to see the Emperor, she forced herself to concentrate on the war. There was no running away now. Celine had to gather all of her knowledge and skills to defeat the evil in this world. This was her sole purpose. The tears slowly began to dry as she flew quickly. Her newfound sense of purpose drove her to another length as she felt strength and feelings of vengeance mixing seamlessly together.